Hey everyone, welcome to another Making a Geek. I am Damien DiCarlo. I am joined with a few people on our panel today. I am joined with writer, producer Craig Miller. How you doing?
Okay, how are you, Damien?
I am well, thank you. We also welcome Bryant Dillon of Fanbase Press. Hey Bryant,
Hey, Damien, good to be back.
good to see you again. Also, my co-host today will be Makayla Meyers. Hello, Makayla.
Thanks for having me. Hi.
Thanks for being here. So we have quite a retrospective to talk about. We've talked about this already on Making a Geek. We've discussed the Star Wars saga. Now it's time to venture into the original trilogy. And in this case, we are looking at episode 4, which was technically the first installment back in 1977 in order of the release. But we're going to look at this a little more chronologically speaking, as far as the time period in this whole Skywalker saga, how it fits into the new movies, maybe even some of the shows that we've watched on Disney Plus. So I'll just go ahead and get going on looking back here. I'm going to pose a question and ask each of you, and let's get your opinions. I would say that looking back at these films in particular, what I mean in particular, I mean the original trilogy. We've revisited before many, many times over. What is it now to each of you, how it's being watched chronologically speaking, in terms of the new prequels now with the old in order and so on? We'll start with you, Bryant. Let's get your opinion and your thoughts here.
That's an interesting question. I guess where I would start is I would say that I am not usually a fan of the chronological watch through, just because I feel like the films play out better if you have the originally intended reveal of, Darth Vader being Luke Skywalker's father complete, that's not given away prior to it happening in the film. I think the Empire was designed to have that be shocking, have that be unknown. And so it's hard to force it not to be like that. That said, I feel like because we know these films so well, it's very unlikely that even if you have not watched these films, that you're going to come to them and go, I have no idea who Darth Vader is, or I have no idea about any of these characters. It's just so seeped into our pop culture. So basically putting that out there to say, one of the fun things for me as a fan, and I think a lot of fans now, is that these films can, almost similar to the MCU, when a new entry comes out, they can constantly be reviewed and seen through a different light. I mean, one thing I'm really excited about right now with A New Hope is we're going to have an Obi-Wan Kenobi series coming out very soon. And it's probably going to change a lot of the way that we see the interactions between Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi in A New Hope. We'll see them through new eyes. They'll have new context. And so things like that are very exciting to me. I know some other fans, like, that bothers them, but I enjoy this process of being able to watch something I've seen dozens of times and have new questions arise, see line readings in a different way. And that is something that is exciting about being able to view them consecutively, is that they do play out differently if you go through them, episode 1, episode 2, episode 3, so on.
Right.
So yeah, that's what I would offer.
How about you, Craig? How have these films impacted you?
I mean, I very much agree with Bryant on this. Yes, you obviously you can watch them in story chronology, and you get one version. I'm sorry, I have a very insistent cat here. You get one version of the saga, and watching them in release order, production order, you actually kind of get a different story, because it is being told as, here's the story. Now here's something that more or less tells you how we got to where we are. I think one of the problems, of course, is that it wasn't conceived as a whole. it was conceived in bits and pieces, and there's a lot of invention of stuff that might be what led into it. And it's not even the stuff George was originally thinking of, because everything changed constantly, even in the original trilogy. The first two movies were pretty much as conceived. The third movie is a completely different movie than originally envisioned. So, you could watch it in any order, but I mean, it's like watching Rogue One, which, yes, takes place in story order beforehand, but really we didn't know all that stuff, and it didn't exist. So I don't know that seeing it in the chronological order tells you anything.
Right.
I think it's more fascinating, and I really like Rogue One, but I think it's more fascinating as and here's how we got there, as opposed to let's watch this unfold.
Right. I would say that your opinion here, Craig, is a very valuable one. Just for some of the audience that may not remember you from the last time you were on the show, what is it that you did on Star Wars, so everyone can know a little bit more about you?
Well, my title was Director of Fan Relations. Originally in 1976, before the movie came out, I was a consultant helping Charlie Lippincott, who is the head of marketing on Star Wars, figure out how to market the film to fans. I was a lifelong science fiction and comics fan. And so I helped with going to San Diego Comic-Con and all the other conventions and all the other stuff we did. And then right after Star Wars opened, I was brought on full time as Director of Fan Relations. And as in that regard, I was a publicist, but with a special remit to deal with conventions and fanzines and fandom.
Right.
But then continued on doing general publicity and producing things like our visit to Sesame Street with R2 and 3PO and commercials and all kinds of things like that.
So it's interesting to get your perspective on this, being there from the beginning. And it's also, I would say, probably see it from your point of view would be very different from the typical fan, just because you were part of production, you were part of getting this thing going and off its feet. And it seems like you have probably the type of insight that most producers do, which is let's just see how this turns out, because you're kind of flying off to see where this goes, and hopefully it goes where you want it to go. But as a fan, as a consumer, you're loving every bit, no matter what you're given, typically.
Yeah, well, like I said, I was a lifelong fan. So when I sat in a screening room at Fox in early May of 77, and that, giant Star Destroyer came on screen, I was like everyone else. I was like, this is the movie I've been waiting for all my life. It was, I was a fan watching the movie. But I think something else, adding to your original question, is, I'm a lot older than you guys. I saw the movies as they came out from the beginning. Other people saw other movies first. A lot of people saw the prequels first because that's when they were kids. So they come to those movies differently than I came to them.
Right. Absolutely true. And it's actually a great thing on this panel. I have my co-host Makayla with me today. Makayla, you're one of the younger fans of Star Wars, and you came into this knowing prequels and sequels. What is your take on seeing these movies now in this order that was supposed to be seen, quote unquote? How do you feel about that?
I love it. I mean, I really do agree with Mr. Dillon and Craig, because, no matter what order you watch any of the movies, you can develop that true love of Star Wars. I personally, as Craig was saying, came into the Star Wars fandom with the prequels. And it's funny because my friends and I were just talking about this the other day. We have a mutual friend who is just now coming to Star Wars, and she was asking where she should start. So a bit of a debate happened because some were saying start with the originals, some were saying start with the prequels. Others are saying don't start with the prequels because, and they're very, very picky Star Wars nerds.
Let the argument ensue.
They're very picky Star Wars nerds, as you have to understand. They were saying, oh, they're a bunch of war movies. You shouldn't start there. And I was saying, well, I wouldn't quite say that. But yeah, that's where a lot of people start with. And no matter where you come into it, you can automatically develop that love of Star Wars because it's that original fight of good versus evil that just never fails to capture our admiration, because really each of us have that internal struggle, whether it's, it's not exactly with the Force, but it's struggles with imperfection and
right.
thinking and mindsets and things like that. But I am happy the way that I came into the Star Wars fandom with the prequels, because quite honestly, you get to see the familial ties of the original characters first. So you get to know the background, you get to know them personally. You almost feel closer
Right.
to Luke, to Leia, to Han, everybody. You get to know their history, and you see that bond with them. You get to know their heritage, and you understand that character more, and it just brings out a different side. So I am really happy the way that I came into that.
You also came in at a point where I think it's fair to say, not just in terms of pushing more for equality, but seeing more of a presence of more female lead characters. And this is something that, not that the originals weren't strong in, but this is now even more. So you have more content, more fandom for everyone of all ages. Bryant, I have a question for you. And I'm curious because you're about my age. Looking back at these films, specifically episode 4, what was it like seeing episode 4 for you in an age where movies are now predominantly CGI versus model work? What does that do to you when you see an old film like that, like when it comes to model work?
Well, obviously, I would say that if you're, even the most minuscule Star Wars fan, there's a huge amount of nostalgia for these films. And I think that also goes into practical effects, just when you think about the way that people like George Lucas or Steven Spielberg comes to mind, use these practical effects to such degree in a very specific, time for kids coming up. I mean, it's mostly we're thinking like the 80s to the early 90s, I guess, when we're thinking back to our own personal, generation of nostalgia. But I feel like Star Wars in some ways seemed to kick that off, in a lot of ways. I think it almost reminds me of the closest thing I can think of, and I'm not sure if Craig would probably be able to speak more to this, but I had friends who, when they saw the first Avengers film, they were like, this was beautiful because I could share with my family, who has known me to be this like intense comic book person for so long. I could share with them like, oh, this is why I'm so into these characters. This is what I'm seeing, in my mind that I've always wanted to like share with the rest of the world. And I think Star Wars, A New Hope had a bit of that, because they really, created that imagined world that many were seeing on the page, or in their own mind while reading on the page, for so long with sci-fi novels, with things like adventure serials, which were, they went to a certain point, but Star Wars elevated that to a cinematic experience that everyone could kind of enjoy. It wasn't just this really intense, passionate, but small fan base. And so I think part of that is definitely the fact that the practical effects, there's something to them. There's something to them that is hard to grasp exactly what it is, but it's the presence of, I think, in camera that CGI can sometimes achieve, but struggles to. I think we'll get there one day. We have got there with, there's, several films I could name where I'm like, the CGI effects are amazing in this film. But there is a natural struggle to be like, well, I have to make it look like it's lighted as if it would in reality. And then we have to make it move the way that it would move in reality. And if it's something that, like an alien creature that no one has ever seen, well, there's an additional layer of difficulty, because how do you tackle the ability to make that seem real that you would be dealing with if it was practical as well?
Right.
So yeah, I think these practical effects hold up a lot longer right now, and I think that Star Wars obviously was just a game changer, complete game changer in the practical effects game. So.
Makayla, what does this look like for you? Now you're younger in age, and back in the day when we used to rely on models and practical effects, what's it like looking back for you, as knowing more or less, for lack of a better word, you were spoiled with some really awesome CGI effects, but looking back to model work, what is that like for you now?
I love it because, you look at, in comparing it to, let's say, the sequels of Star Wars, people of my generation have kind of been sensitized to CGI. That's kind of what we expect from these kinds of movies. But looking back on the originals, it's special. It's the best of that era. It's the best of what they had to offer. This is them saying, let's take this idea and do the best with what we've got and make it into a reality with this movie. And I love it because, even in watching it with, everything that I've watched nowadays with the, CGI of Star Wars trilogy, Avatar, MCU, things like that. I love it because it's got the nostalgia vibe still. Right. It's just so special. And I developed such a high respect, as Bryant was saying, I developed such a high respect because I know that things like that were difficult to work with. Even nowadays, CGI is very difficult to work with. I have such a high respect for those who work in that field. I could never do some of those things. But, even looking back on the originals and things, it's absolutely awesome. Certain scenes in A New Hope where they're in the Millennium Falcon and they're jumping to light speed and things like that. That wasn't necessarily CGI, but that's still, it looked real, and it was awesome when you're in the theater and seeing that on the big screen. You feel like you're in the Millennium Falcon, and I think that that's just awesome that they were able to convey that feeling to the audience even back then.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember, Bryant, we were on, or I was just me on your podcast, Fan Base Weekly, and we talked about a look back at Ninja Turtles, the second one, Secret of the Ooze, and we talked about how those practical effects, for me, I actually prefer it. And the reason why is it's fleshed out, it's real, it's something tangible. I can almost feel just by looking at it, right? Even though I know what it is. I know it's a rubber suit, but I prefer that a lot of times over CG effects, only because it just has more of a real look to it versus trying to impress me with so much 4K detail. I'm more concentrated on the visual of, I want to see something, real, earthy, tangible. And I appreciated that about the old films very much.
Well, and the prequels have some amazing and beautiful visuals. George really obviously is a visual genius. And I think that he achieved things with CG that not only stand the test of time, but also push the technology into a place it had not yet been. So he's advancing, the medium of film craft that way as well. But I personally myself, as much as I love those films and the visuals, there was something about when Abrams came back and said, "Hey, we're going to do some practical effects." There was something about The Force Awakens that felt like Star Wars, and maybe that's okay because the prequels are sort of this gilded age, it's a different time, a different feel. But it was such a comforting, nostalgic feeling and exciting for me to be like, oh, this is feeling like I'm just picking up the next chapter from Return of the Jedi and going on,
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, there's with practical effects, with miniatures and that sort of thing, you have an advantage in some of the excuse me, side issues like, as Bryant mentioned, lighting, because you're really lighting them. You're not thinking what lighting might look like and trying to apply that as animation. You're, and you're dealing with gravity. One of the big problems with a lot of special effects, be it animation of characters or objects, spaceships, is gravity. In using models, you have the gravity affecting the model. In CGI, it's again something you have to create and invent and apply to your image.
Right.
So that makes it harder to make it seem real. So it's really only the really best CGI that is able to bring in all those different things. And yeah, there's plenty of terrible practical miniature work as well, but it's easier to reach the minimum bar of making it look good. I think, in not that any of it's easy,
Yeah.
but it's just because it exists, so you can deal with it in that kind of thing, in your camera to make it look that much better.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I have one of my good friends that actually I was just with last night. He is a visual effects specialist for some of the Marvel and the DC films, and it's no walk in the park either for what they do. It's a lot that
Oh
they
yeah,
do.
yeah. None of it's easy.
It, like you said, Craig, it's all hard work. It's just a matter of what we prefer in some terms of, scrutiny with what we like to look at. And some people are entitled to feel differently. If they don't like visual effects, they like practical effects. It's just a matter of what we prefer. But by no
Also,
means
what
do
you're
I think
trying to accomplish. Some things, just on their scope, are better accomplished in CG.
technically, yeah, I could see that.
There's a great example, honestly, in Star Wars, with the taking the alternate cuts we have for the X-wing red team pilots and the Y-wing yellow team pilots, and bringing them into Rogue One, the conclusion of Rogue One, something that is only going to be achieved through CGI effects, but is done in such a great way of marrying both the two different types of footage and two stories. One from several decades ago.
Absolutely. Speaking of effects, I'll segue into my next thought. And as we know, in 1997, George spent about 10 million to clean the original negatives, digitally restore all footage to make what we now call the special edition. This is a lot. You're already laughing, Brian, because you know where I'm going with this. Let's go with each of these thoughts now that we've talked about practical effects versus CG. How do we feel about the special edition versions of the trilogy? Let's start with you, Craig.
Well, some of them are more special than others, I think. Yeah, cleaning stuff up, that's great. Always better, restorations. There were some places where stuff was added that I think were beneficial to the movie. They added to the realism in Star Wars, and I'm sorry, I still can't call it A New Hope. It wasn't called that, and that never appeared on the movie until the re-release after Empire. But in Star Wars, there are things where we've added, the additional characters, additional alien creatures, that sort of thing. That does help give it more of the feel. And clearly those are things George would have wanted to do had he had the ability, time, and money.
Right.
There's scenes in Empire where we can see out windows of Cloud City, where we have, more establishing things that help realize the world. But there's other stuff that got added to the special editions that I don't think made the movies better. Some scenes that got added, some other stuff. I don't know that they they don't make the movie terrible, but I don't think they really added much.
Brian, I know you're itching. I'm going to go ahead and give you the floor now. Let's go
Oh,
into
yeah.
this.
I surprisingly maybe I'm not as down on the special editions as some of my peers. I agree with everything that Craig has said to a degree. I think that at the special editions when they were released, adding those things that make the world seem bigger or as intended, I think that's very helpful. I don't mind at all some of the fan service of like, we put this spaceship from this novel in the sky for 5 seconds. I think that's kind of fun, and connects the universe in a way. And it's not like it's distracting from what the original intent is. But there are funny enough with each film, I think maybe Empire might be the one that I'm like, that one's fine as is. There's one or two moments where you're like, if I could pick and choose, I'd take that one out. Obviously, I think the big controversial one is Han and Greedo. Changing that exchange and the various ways that it has changed. With like starting off with Greedo shooting first, then we had a weird one where Han moved his head really awkwardly and dodged the shot. And I mean, the latest one I think that we saw is now, for whatever reason, Greedo says McClunky right before he gets.
I did not know that one actually.
This was, I think it was the latest update for the 3D release that kind of got hampered by the purchase of Disney. When they put the films back on Disney Plus, there were a couple new changes, just slight things like that.
Like the color lightsaber and whatnot, like those
right
things.
And I think they added like Vader says no now when he throws the Emperor down the chasm. I don't love the idea of like encouraging people to continuously tinker with their creations, but at the same time
broke, right
but at the same time it's theirs. If they want to mess around with it, who am I, a fan who's only appreciative of being able to share in this experience, to say no, you're wrong? I mean, I think criticism is fine. Art is meant to be critiqued to a certain degree, but I think the special editions are just fine. I think everything could be relieved completely if they would just eventually release the original editions, on the current media. Agreed. I know there's some behind the scenes legal snafus for that. Right. But I think that'll happen eventually. Disney's going to have these properties for a long time, so eventually there will come a time when they will restore those original cuts, and that will be available on a Blu-ray or whatever the current media is.
Right. Absolutely, I totally agree. I think
George has a long history of continuously tinkering with Star Wars. When we first released Star Wars, people would say that they heard this dialogue or that sound in the movie. This was in the 77 release. And they were all right, even though they all heard different things, because George couldn't stop fiddling with the sound mix. And so the 70 millimeter 8-track Dolby stereo has a different sound mix from the regular Dolby stereo, and has a different sound mix from the 35 millimeter. And not just because of the lack of stereo channels, but George was actively moving sounds up and down. So sometimes you heard stormtroopers say one thing, and other times you didn't hear them say anything. So, and that was on the original release. That wasn't, later monkeying around with it. So there's a long history of that with Star Wars, but I'm waiting for the version where Greedo says, "Okay, we'll trust you," and he and Han hug as they walk out of the bar.
Makayla, I have a question for you. Specifically towards you, and then we'll eventually go to the others. In expectation of the new Obi-Wan Kenobi series, how do we feel episode 4 will be an influence here? We'll start off with you.
I think it'll be a great influence. And not even just on episode 4, but I think a great deal on the prequels as well. But, I'm really looking forward for more of Obi-Wan and, Anakin freshly turned to Vader reaction.
Right.
Because I've always craved that interaction there. And I know that we're finally going to get it.
Right.
We've seen in certain shows, I won't give anything away, that there have been important characters in the Star Wars universe that didn't discover what Anakin had become until a while later.
Right.
But we're going to get something different with this. And I'm really looking forward to it. I've been craving that interaction, and that drama, that intensity, because we know that they were brothers, they loved each other, and now look at what they've become.
Yeah, and we got a little bit of that in episode 3 towards the end, specifically just at that point in time.
Yeah.
But like you said, I kind of feel the same way. I'm hungering for a little bit more of that interaction because they work well, those two characters like that. I mean, we won't even talk about the actors. They're phenomenal, but those two characters, the way the drama ensues of how their relationship is essentially crumbling, but sort of hanging by a thread at certain times is very, very interesting. Bryant, what are your thoughts on how this will influence the Obi-Wan Kenobi series coming up?
I think definitely A New Hope has to be a huge influence because they know that that's where they need to end up to a degree. That the Ben Kenobi, Obi-Wan Kenobi that Alec Guinness portrayed is where we need to see, at least spiritually to a degree. The Ewan McGregor character has to reach that, and it's interesting because there's these periods of time that are very interesting that have been sort of left open for discussion or further exploration. I think the first one was when, well, maybe not the first one, but a big one was when episode 2 and episode 3 jumped over the Clone Wars. There was obviously a lot to explore there, and it has now been in very interesting ways. And this idea of what happens to both Anakin and Obi-Wan after episode 3, there's a lot there that I think people assumed we might see in episode 3. Anakin is not the Darth Vader we know in A New Hope when we leave him at episode 3. He's waking up still asking about the woman he loves, asking if she's all right. When we reach him in A New Hope, he is someone who clearly has taken all the pain and suffering that he's feeling and decided, well, I have nothing left beyond delivering this on other individuals, to essentially you pour it out of myself, to have some semblance of an existence that isn't just directed at the failures or pain that he's carrying with him. And I think Ben's in a similar, Ben is in a similar place where the man we see at the end of episode 3 is not the individual who rescues Luke in A New Hope. He's very broken, and how could you not be? And one of the big things, like, we make assumptions. I think that as Makayla was saying, that some of these characters, we assume, they know what we know, or we don't think, how is the death or rise of death of Anakin, rise of Vader, how has that been viewed? As far as we know, Obi-Wan believes that Anakin's dead, that he left his friend on the shores, if you call them that, of Mustafar to burn and die, whatever the Force had intentions to do with him. He doesn't know that he's become this mechanical thing as of yet. And so there's so many levels to the trauma, I guess, which is interesting to me, is like, here is a man who's thinking, I lost everything. I lost my world, my best friend, my purpose for existing to a degree, and my moral standing. I mean, he struggles in episode 3 with being charged with killing Anakin. He tries to push back of like, well, no, I can't do that, but he goes through that process. And I don't think you can go through something like that and not be changed significantly. And so now he's left alone alone in a very barren environment, a very hopeless environment, to figure out what to do next, essentially, to watch over this young kid and sit with his demons. And so the idea that there's something waiting around the corner where he's going to realize, oh, I didn't just kill my friend. My friend has become even more twisted, more grotesque. And what guilt do I feel for what I did now? Like, even just the simple idea of like, holy crap, should I have killed him? Would that have been better? Did I turn him into this by leaving him there?
What could I have done?
Burn little. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I hope they dig that deep, but that's what speaks to me. And then that interaction on A New Hope, where we see them once again come together. There's a lot that we can, you can assume that's just them seeing each other for the first time, or there's a lot you can dig into there. Vader says to Obi-Wan, "You should not have come back." Well, does that mean back to the Death Star? Does that mean a previous interaction? And there's this interesting thing that was written without intention, but Obi-Wan refers to Darth Vader as Darth because that's his first name in the film,
right.
but not anymore. That's a Sith title. And then what kind of mental break is going on there, or change in personality where I won't even call you Anakin now? I'm basically saying Sith, evil thing,
Right.
there's a lot of interesting stuff there to play with.
Well, but I think you're putting on there that we actually knew this backstory.
No, I know the intention was it was just his name.
So it wasn't being done cleverly. It was
right. No, it's something to be reimagined now, I think, as creators are looking back at these films.
I think, we're applying knowledge to the movies with the assumption in our heads that all of this really was planned and is of a piece. And we have to look at them, since it is a ongoing story, that's the way we have to deal with them, even though we know it wasn't created that way. One of the things I think is interesting is in the prequels, the Jedi are all good friends and they hang out together and they work over
Train.
things that they deal with. But in the later movies, the original trilogy and the sequels, every Jedi we meet is now made himself a hermit on some desolate planet.
Yep.
So if we are going to overlay something to this, it's like, okay, what is it about being a Jedi that makes you want to go away from society, go away from your world, and every person you've ever known?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of parallels between Obi-Wan here and Yoda when they both
Yoda and Luke in the sequels.
Yeah.
Set himself off in the same way.
There's an interesting Henry David Thoreau kind of mentality, I feel like, because and again, I don't think this was intended, but it's nice to kind of make your own headcanon, if you will, about how it connects. But we go from the prequels where the Jedi literally are, the Jedi Council is on the peak of a huge building in the center of the galaxy, and so they go from very, very lofty, status, if you will, or influence in the main society to this almost get back to the roots kind of mentality. And I wonder if that will be in the writing, this idea of part of Yoda realizing that the way they fell was that they got away from what being a Jedi was. It began to become this government bureaucracy as opposed to what is the Force telling us? What is our place in the universe?
Yeah, it also depends where they're going to start the Obi-Wan series.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
You could start with Obi-Wan finding out about the Force and becoming a Jedi. You can start with him on the Jedi Council. You could start with him on, Tatooine as a hermit. You could start telling the story anywhere, and there's a whole different set of tales you can tell about him. You've mentioned a couple of, I think, very interesting places to start the story. I just don't know what they've got in mind
Sure.
and where they're going to go with it.
Yeah, there's so many different things we can imagine where it would go, and I'm still clueless really at the end of the day. Like I'm very excited. I mean, at the end of the day, we know what'll happen, but it's how do you get there?
I
Yeah,
also like
exactly.
to, I would also like to interject and just say, I always like to tell people that are interested in seeing Obi-Wan Kenobi to start with seeing Clone Wars, because you get to really get closer to Obi-Wan, you get closer to Anakin. The really unique thing about Clone Wars is that throughout all of the seasons, you develop this hope, almost this ignorance that what eventually happens to Anakin doesn't happen, because you just get so close to this character and to Obi-Wan. You see their bond, you see how deep it goes, you see how much they're like brothers. You know, in Revenge of the Sith, he said, "You are my brother, Anakin, I loved you." You see that in this series, everything that they did for each other. And then the fall of Anakin, it brings
Absolutely.
out so much intensity. So that's why I always tell people, if you're interested in seeing Obi-Wan Kenobi, definitely look at Clone Wars, because you get the background, you get why this is so intense, why this is so stressful and saddening, and just you understand where I mean, obviously depending on where the series takes place, as you guys were saying, but you still get to know the character more in depth. And like I said, you also, the way that the series is written, it's very interesting that you develop that hope, that ignorance. I got into the series with my mom and we watched the whole thing together, and we both had that hope of, oh, maybe it won't happen, until you see the ripple, the domino effect of what's about to happen. So if you want
Absolutely.
some pain, go on ahead and watch Clone Wars.
That was going to be my next question, which you just answered. You read my mind, and I also want to interject to say that you look like
Jedi mind trick.
like a Princess Leia Force ghost, by the way, with the lighting.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
The lighting was unintentional, so
Spooky. So same question posed to the two of you, Craig and Bryant, before we finish up here. What, where, and how should someone start with Star Wars? And I know we've discussed this before, Brian, on the last retrospectives, but just maybe put in again your 2 cents as to where someone should start, whether it be Clone Wars, this movie, Episode 1. What's your opinion, Brian?
You know, I have 2 young daughters now. They're just over a year old. When I mean, they've already been introduced to Star Wars, so it's not like Star Wars is not going to be something they know well. You know, they watch all sorts of videos. They love Baby Yoda and Porgs at this point.
I mean,
They've been
look at
educated
Face.
since the womb.
Right, exactly. So there's part of me that would just say, hey, it really doesn't matter what pulls you in. You start where you want to. You know, everyone's going to connect to different characters. Everyone's going to feel like different story arcs speak to them. I mean, there's people that I know who were not captured at all by anything in the prequels or the original trilogy, but have now said, you know what, Rey really pulled me in, or Finn really pulled me in. Heck, Ben Solo pulled me in, you know, because he has a huge fandom as well. But you know, and while I think that there's a lot of things that you can discuss, it doesn't. I don't think that matters as long as the story is something that you're getting to enjoy. The moral messages behind these stories, the way that they explore characters, even when the stories have flaws, I think are really interesting and speak to a sense of like old myth or mythology, and I think that's something to be enjoyed by a wider and wider audience.
Absolutely.
I will take my girls through at some point and start with Star Wars or A New Hope, and go through that, you know, in that order, just because again, that's the order that speaks to me. It's the order that makes sense to me. But I don't think that there is anything such as a wrong order or a wrong place to begin.
Absolutely. Completely.
Yeah,
100% how I feel. Go ahead, Craig.
I mostly agree. I think part of it also depends on how old you are. chronologically and in, you know, emotionally, intellectually, because not that Star Wars A New Hope was aimed at an old audience, but it was aimed at an adult audience. It was not, it's an adventure movie, so even little kids can relate to it. It's pretty pure in that regard. But the prequels were deliberately targeted for a younger, not little kid, but a younger audience.
Right.
So if you're starting with younger kids, if you're starting with 10 and 12-year-olds, those might be better suited for an introduction. Heck, you know, you could introduce them with the Ewoks.
Yeah, I remember that.
You know, I mean, I really think it depends on who your kids or who your friends are that you're introducing. Where is the best place to bring them in? It's pretty clear that the Star Wars universe has got an awful lot of entry ramps that you can go into and find your way into enjoying the whole thing. So I'm not sure it makes a difference.
So I'll go ahead and start with the Christmas special. Got it.
I recommend it.
There you go.
Hey, you know, I in my book I talk about the holiday special, and
I remember. Yeah.
while I don't ever say it's good, in fact, I say the opposite. I think it's not as bad as a lot of people think for what it is.
And what most people don't know is what transpires on the Christmas special is actually canon. I'm kidding. I don't think it is.
Actually, part of it is.
Part of it is.
Is it? Oh, that's great.
Well, you know,
they've really embraced the whole Life Day aspect, you know, in the last few years. And I think there's actually a Life Day at Disney parks at Galaxy's Edge now.
yeah, there is Life Day at Disneyland now in the Star Wars land. Boba Fett's gun from the animated has been shown as his weapon. And even though George hates the holiday special and has since its release, the whole Wookiee sequence was George's idea. When I asked George back in 1977, because we were getting lots of people saying, why doesn't Chewie get a medal? George's answer was, Wookiees don't like medals. That was something alien to the Wookiee culture, and that they would be going to the Wookiee planet to celebrate Chewbacca's being a hero. And that sequence in a holiday special was George's idea of going to Life Day and all of that. So there's no reason for that not to be canon.
Well said. I stand corrected. Well, that's all the time we have. We are so happy that we did this retrospective on episode 4. Eventually, we'll be covering episode 5, Empire Strikes Back. So stay tuned for that. And before we go, though, where can folks find all of you? We'll start with you, Craig, and then Bryant, and then Makayla.
Well, in the immediate future, I'll be at Star Wars Celebration on a panel about fandom, and I'll be signing copies of my book, and they can find me. I'm old, so they can find me on Facebook. This is my book. I've got Star Wars Memories has a page, and I've got a personal page. And that's the easiest place to find me and contact me.
How about you, Bryant?
Oh, you can find me on Twitter at Comic Book Slayer. I'm on Instagram at Comic Book Sniffer. Also, if you want to check out Fanbase Press, which is the indie comic publisher and geek culture website that I co-run with my wife, you can find us at fanbasepress.com. We're also on Instagram, Facebook. We have a podcast, the Fanbase Weekly, that Damien's been on, that is on Apple Podcasts and other podcast services if you want to check that out. And last, I'll offer that my wife, Barbara, and co-founder of the company, she'll also be at Star Wars Celebration on a panel on Saturday. on The Mandalorian and Joseph Campbell. So if that sounds interesting
Awesome.
for you and you'll be at the show, check it out.
Makayla, I just realized I think you don't have social media.
Ain't nobody got time for that. But
Ain't nobody
if
got
you're
time for
really
that,
into
okay.
that, then fast people first, I
And
guess.
no one can track down a Force ghost anyway. So you'll appear when you appear.
That's right. That's right. Hey.
All right. And you can find me at Damien_DeCarlo on Instagram, and then makingitgeek.com for everything that I do. Until next time, everybody, keep calm and geek out. Good night.
Good night.